Good, thank you very much. I want to welcome you all here this evening. This has been my great pleasure to help facilitate on behalf of the Jefferson County Historical Society and the Jefferson County Museum. Tonight's speaker is an expert on the subject of the Underground Railroad in Iowa, and in southeast Iowa in particular. I've had some interest in the Underground Railroad, and in pursuing the subject, as I've hunted around the countryside finding parts of the story, as I would meet with people uncovering bits and pieces, oftentimes people would say, you know, if you really want to know about the Underground Railroad, you ought to talk to this gentleman, Lewis Savage. There's that old saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, on the Underground Railroad in Iowa, it turns out that the roads now, in our times, lead to Lewis Savage as someone knowledgeable about the old stories. It's turned out that this has become my old friend in the journey on the Underground Railroad. And there's an intergenerational thing going on here. Lewis has studied the Underground Railroad all his life, his 89 years. I've come to it more recently in my 50 years. And as I have been visiting with different people of Lewis's generation, in particular, I've been asking them to tell me about their parents' recollections and their grandparents' recollections. Bit by bit, you know, the old telephone game when we start to share a story around person to person, bits and pieces of it drop off. So I've been more earnest in finding people like Lewis to jump back an extra generation to hear the stories closer to the source. And so I wanted to use this opportunity to bring the stories up to the surface again and bring them to the present, bring them from the past more to the present. So really it's a real privilege, I think, to have our old friend here, Lewis Savage, from down in Salem, Iowa, resident there of Henry County. So Lewis, I'll give you the evening to tell us some of the stories of the Underground Railroad.
I want to thank Doug for his kind comments and words, and I want to thank my cousin Mary Alice Savage for furnishing transportation for me this evening and coming up to be with you. I appreciate the cooperative spirit of the Jefferson County Historical Society and the Museum Board in cooperating together in this meeting. And I'm glad for those of you who have been interested enough to come and share this evening. I have been rather busy getting things laid out here that may be of interest to you. A little later, when we have a break, you can take a look and see about some of the material that I've laid out. I see friends from Fairfield Friends meeting, from Pleasant Plain Friends, and I expect if I looked a little farther, maybe I'd see other. You know, it's been 40 years since I was here in Fairfield and helped to start the Friends meeting here. And It was a good time in our lives as we shared in many things in the community life. And I don't know, I wondered as I thought about this meeting, how many people in Fairfield are going to remember a person who lived here 40 years ago. But I'm glad for each one of you who have come this evening. The subject is large enough that I cannot cover everything this evening. It's large enough that I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've discovered within the last few weeks, so it isn't all covered yet. And maybe I can awaken your interest and you can find something of interest that will stimulate you and help you to stand up in life, to reach out to someone in need and help them along life's way, because that was what the Quakers did in the early day. They had a heart of compassion for the people in slavery, and they wanted to help them. They were willing to stand up and furnish them shelter and care when it came their opportunity to do so. There's still many opportunities in life for us to do similar types of things. I'm going to take off my broad-brimmed hat. It's too hot for me. And I would just share with you this morning, I spent 2 hours sharing with 85 students from, I think they were mostly from the 5th grade in the Mediapolis, Wapello, the Muscatine, Wapello school system. That exhausted me, but I had a chance to take a nap and get recovered, and I'm here this evening to share with you, and it's an opportunity. My interest in the Underground Railroad began when I was a boy. We were a family that liked to get together at my grandfather's house. Here's a picture of the old grandparents' home about a mile from where I grew up. That house burned in 1957, so it isn't there. But I'm still here. I still live in the house where I was born. This is a picture of the grandfather as I knew him. He was born in Midland, England in 1832. Though I'll have to change that a little bit. He wasn't born in 1832. He came with his parents and the rest of the family to this country from Midland, England in 1846. And he was 8 years old, so he wasn't born in the date that I said, but he was born a little earlier. But he lived to be 92 years old, and we were a family that gathered there in the grandparents' home as I was growing up, and we enjoyed eating Sunday dinner together. There were quite a few cousins, and we enjoyed sharing life with each other. When it came to dinner conversation, The adults did most of the talking, we did the listening. And one of the things that I listened and heard was about a couple of black families that lived on an adjacent farm right across the road from where my grandfather lived. My grandmother had died earlier, so I didn't know her. But my grandfather died when I was 15 years old, so I knew this rather distinguished gentleman and heard him tell about the stories of sharing work with these two black families that were there on what was called the Allen Farm, a 500-acre farm owned by a man who lived down near Cape Girardeau, Missouri. It's on the Mississippi River down below St. Louis. And he was a slave owner, but he had in his heart and life, he wasn't satisfied with the slave system. So he bought this large farm of 500 acres up there near Salem, near where the Quakers lived, and sent two of the slave families up there to look after the farm. They couldn't farm it all, so other farmers would rent out certain portions of the farm. And I knew something about, I knew that this was different. I never saw these black families, but I heard my grandfather talk about them. He exchanged work with the black men and shared with us grandchildren something about them. This man, I've seen his will because he owned land in Henry County. A copy of his will is in the court records in Henry County. And one provision in his will was that he was going to give freedom to a number of his slaves. I don't know the full story because it doesn't give everything, but he made the will about 2 years before he died. I think the wife disagreed with him about what he put into that will about setting some of the slave families free. And as he became ill and death was approaching, she went to the lawyer, and together they fixed out a codicil to his will. I don't know whether he fully understood what this codicil said or not, but there was one provision in the codicil that said that it rescinded number 5 in his will that took away this provision about setting the slaves free. To me, as I read that, I thought, what a cruel thing. What a cruel thing to these blacks to have promised them their freedom and then to learn that this promise wasn't going to be kept. But that was one of the cruelties of the slave system. Eventually, after being a school teacher and a Quaker minister for 40 years, I came back to the old farm home there near Salem and operated it for 30 years. During that period, I served as the chairman of the board of the Lewelling House for 20 years. That's quite a period of volunteer service. but I was interested in it and was glad to do it. One of the things that I discovered was the first incident of the Quakers giving assistance to runaways. It was recorded in an ad that appeared in a Burlington newspaper, even before Salem was settled. And here's a map. You know about where Salem is, in the southern part of Henry County. But even before settlement was made, the slave owners heard that this settlement was going to be made in this new area, the Iowa country, the Black Hawk Territory, and they began to share together, knowing that perhaps the people of the broad-brimmed hats might help the runaways. One of the things I guess they didn't count on was the fact that the blacks, even though they couldn't read and write, they could hear. And I don't think the blacks knew very much about where Iowa was, but they knew it was someplace north. And they lived, two black slaves lived in the state of Missouri, down in Boone County, Missouri. Boone County, Missouri is down on the Missouri River, down not too far from Jefferson City. If I get this map straightened out here and get it so you can see, I put a little circle down here where Boone County is. It about halfway across the state of Missouri from where Salem, Iowa is. They couldn't read or write. If they had a map, it wouldn't do them any good. But they could read the North Star and knew that if they kept traveling north, somewhere up there was this new town of Salem with the people with the broad-brimmed hats. And this was only about 1 year after the settlement was made at Salem. This was in June, the first settlement, June of 1837. A year later, in August, these men ran away and decided they had enough of the system, and eventually they ended up at Salem. And they found friendly people there. They stayed there and worked, and the sad part of it was they didn't go on to Canada. Well, their owner, Thomas Flint, knew about the same information they did. He knew where Salem was, so he came looking, and he found these two men. He came up there, found them, seized them, and was going to take them back to Missouri. But he made a mistake. He stayed overnight at a place in Salem, and these two men took the opportunity. They ran away, and they didn't stop running that time. they kept on going. And that is the first instance, recorded instance, of the Quakers or the broad-brimmed hat people of helping the runaway slaves. The second recorded instance, if I had time, I would read a letter written by Asa Turner, who was pastor of the Denmark Congregational Church, as he wrote about the assistance that Salem Quakers had given to runaways. But I feel that it would take too long this evening, so I want to just share with you something that he included. He told about two other men who came from somewhere, he didn't say where in Missouri, and they came to Salem too. And some Quaker men got them into their wagon and were going to help them to go on their way toward Canada. Some of the slave catchers or interested people followed these men and seized these runaways and took them back to Missouri. And they fined the men who were helping these runaways several $100s. That is the second recorded instance that I know about wherein the Quakers had given assistance to the runaway slaves. How many of you have heard about Ruel Daggs and his slaves running away? Have you heard about Ruel Daggs? It's one of the most well-known incidents about assistance being given by Salem Quakers. Ruel Daggs, while we lived here in Fairfield, I went down to Cahokia, Missouri, and went to the library and talked to the librarian to see if I could find out where Ruel Daggs lived. And she brought out the first printed atlas of Clark County, Missouri, and showed me on this atlas where Ruel Daggs' farm was, 8 miles straight west of Cahokia. And he came out from Virginia to Kentucky, but then on out to Clark County, Missouri. He had 16 slaves that he brought with him when he came west. 9 of those slaves, back in 1848, decided they'd had enough of the system and they were going to run away. And so they crossed the Des Moines River down near Farmington and came up to Salem. Well, the slave catchers caught up with them just south of Salem and were going to take them back to Missouri. But some of the Quakers said to them, well, what authority do you have to take these people back? Show us your authority. They didn't have any papers showing that they had authority to take these slaves. And the Quakers said, well, we'll go before a justice of peace and have a hearing, and if you can prove that you have the right and authority to take them, we'll, of course, let you take them. But if you can't prove that you have an authorization, then we'll turn them loose and give them their freedom. Well, they had a hearing, and One of the slave catchers' names was Samuel Slaughter. He lived 2 miles east of Farmington. The other slave catcher was James, let's see, I'm going to have to, Doug, can you help me with the other man's name?
These two slave catchers, one was Slaughterer and the other was McClure.
Yes, James McClure was a neighbor of Daggs in Clark County, and they didn't have any written authorization to take these slaves, these blacks, and so some of them went on their way. The women of that company went back with the slave catchers to Missouri. But I want to tell you a little bit about it. One part of it is that Daggs brought a suit against some of the Quakers there, and he sued for $10,000, I think it was, for giving assistance to these runaways and giving assistance to them and being deprived of their services. But one of the ladies, a young woman, name was Julia, I believe she was 16 or 18 years old. She, of course, went back and was a slave until the end of the Civil War. Then she got her freedom. She married a man, and they owned a few acres of land. You know, one of the things that the slave owners said, well, slavery is a good thing for the blacks because they can't look after themselves. It takes a good owner to look after them. But the Hall family has proved otherwise. Julia and her husband had, they had more than one child, but I just remember and want to speak about one, Ira, a son, who became the operator of their farm after when they died, and he became an owner of 500 acres, which I think was a pretty significant operation for not only growing grain, but feeding a cattle herd and livestock. And I think Ira Hall proved that he didn't need somebody looking after him. He could look after himself if he had the opportunity to do so. Well, there are many things in this story that are interesting and that I could share with you. It becomes something of a problem to select a few that I can share with you this evening. And I want to share one story that has come rather recently and tell you how I came to know about this story. Here a few years back, I received a telephone call from a lady who lived in Pasadena, California. She was wanting to find where her great-grandfather, David Hammer, was buried. She knew that he was buried in the New Garden Quaker Cemetery in Lee County, Iowa, but she couldn't find anybody who knew where this cemetery was. She called the courthouse at Fort Madison, but no one there was able to help her. Someone said that she should get in contact with me. At that time, I was the chairman of the board of the Lewelling House. So she called me. Would you excuse me just a moment? I'm going to take time out. Maybe you didn't bring your bottle of water, but with speaking, I need some lubrication. The old vocal cords at 89 years of age need to be wet up a little bit. I don't wet them up with liquor, but I still use good water. Well, she told me that she and her husband were coming through Iowa in a couple months, and she asked me, will you go with us and show us where New Garden Quaker Cemetery is located? And I said, yes, I'll do that, if you let me know when you get here. And so she called me by telephone when they got here into Iowa, and I met them in Salem, went with them down a mile or a half mile north of St. Paul, Iowa, and a mile east. And then a quarter of a mile back in a field is where this old Quaker cemetery is located. The Quakers were careless, unexcusably careless in not keeping up the fence on this cemetery for 30 or 40 years. The livestock had ran over it. They had pushed down all the burial stones except one, and it was up against a tree, and the livestock couldn't push it down. But this couple were determined. A wife began digging in one location, the husband in another, and I in a third location. And it wasn't 2 minutes until the husband said, I found it. And he'd found the stone, but not only a stone, he'd found the burial stone for David Hammer, the wife's great-grandfather. He cleaned the dirt off of it, dug a trench, set the stone upright. They took pictures of it. And as the husband stood there by the stone, he pulled out his billfold. He said, I have $60 in my billfold. I want you to take this $60 and find other people who have ancestors buried here and get a fence built around this cemetery. Well, I said to him, I don't know whether I can do that. Well, there's a little more to that story, and I want to share something about it, but I want to go on with what they said to me. Do you know family by the name of Pickards that living around here? And I said, yes, I do, because Mary Hammer, who was the wife of David Hammer, married Henry Pickard after David died. And Henry Pickard and his first wife had 18 children. 16 of them grew to adulthood. That's a pretty good family. But when the first wife died, there were 7 of them still at home. So he was interested in having a second wife. He looked about him in the New Garden community, and here was a very attractive and beautiful woman, Mary Hammer. She had 8 children in her family, but they got together and had 15 children around their table. That was taking on a wife and a family to boot. They'd been married a year or two, and along in early winter when it was cold, the family was in around the fire. There was a knock on their door, and Henry got up, went to the door, I want to show you a picture of Henry Pickard. It's worth seeing. Here's a picture of Henry Pickard. He was 6 foot and 6 inches tall, weighed 350 pounds. He was quite a man. He was a wealthy man. He owned several farms. But he invited this black man who was there at the door when he opened the door, and the black man had a little child in his arms. He invited the man in to the light and the warmth of the Pickard home. And the man soon told his sad story, as he said that his master had sold his wife downriver when the baby was 3 weeks old, and he decided that he'd had enough of the system. He was going to run away and take their child and go to Canada. But when the father got there to the Pickard home, the child, who was 6 months old at that time, was ill, and he knew that the child would die if he continued on the way to Canada. He asked Henry and Mary Hammer Pickard to take his little girl into their home and keep it until he could go on to Canada and then come back and get the little girl. They never heard anything from the man again. They don't know whether he made it to Canada or not, or whether he was seized before he got there. But Henry and Mary Pickard did the right thing. They kept this little girl in their home. She was child number 16 around their table. She went to Quaker meeting and school with the rest of the children. And when she got to be 20 years old, she wanted to go out on her own, and so she did. She walked from down there near St. Paul, Iowa, into Mount Pleasant, where there was a small black community. She stayed there for some time. We don't know exactly how long. We do know later that she ended up in Des Moines, met and married William Mills, and they worked and lived there and died and are buried in Des Moines. In 1935, Mary, she took her foster mother's name. Mary came to a Pickard family reunion at Donaldson, Iowa, and spoke to the group that were gathered there, about 200 people, and told them how grateful she was for the help the Pickards had given her in her early life, and how much she appreciated their help. That's the story about that tops all the Underground Railroad stories that I've ever read. Most kept or helped runaways for 2 or 3 days, and then they sent them on. But here was a family that kept a runaway for 20 years. Within 15 miles of a slave state of Missouri, yet they were never challenged or confronted because of what they were doing, because of the influence, the umbrella influence of the Quaker community. There's another part to this story, and I'll add a little bit about it. I tried to carry out what this couple from Pasadena asked me to do about building the fence. I went to the owner of the land. The farm was owned by Adrian Dingman, and his brother, Bishop Dingman, who was the bishop of the Catholic Church in Des Moines. And Bishop Dingman was, when he bought that section of the farm and knew that it was a Quaker cemetery, he went to the Quakers, some of the Quakers, and talked to them about it. He wanted a fence built around the cemetery and gave them some money to do it, to help with it. But the Quakers didn't do that. And Adrian Dingman said to me, as I told him about what this family had wanted me to do, he said, well, there's a family down north of Burlington by the name of Thornburg who has relatives buried in this cemetery. I think you ought to go and talk to them. I did, and at first this man and his son said they would help. Then some months later, the man called me and wanted me to go to the courthouse in Fort Madison. He said that he had learned from talking to a lawyer that it wasn't his responsibility to build the fence. It was the township trustees and the township supervisor's responsibility, and he was going to force them to build the fence. Well, I knew right then that that wasn't going to work very good. And I did tell him that I would go to the meeting. And the supervisors gave him an opportunity to make his spiel, but it was a sour grape spiel. And they said to him, there are enough small cemeteries in Lee County, and if we started building fences around each of those cemeteries, we wouldn't get anything done except build fences around cemeteries, and we weren't elected to do that. And so they weren't interested. They gave me a chance to say a few words, and I did. One of my great-grandfathers was an early pioneer Quaker minister. His name was Ephraim Ratliff. He lived up near Salem, and he used to go either by horseback or drive a buggy down to New Garden meeting, which would be maybe about 10 or 12 miles down into Lee County. And I thought, well, this old great-grandfather, the Quakers believed in. They didn't pay their Quaker preachers anything in those early days. They were going to keep them humble and help to keep them poor. But they did the work anyway. And he had a farm, and he operated the farm, but he was faithful in going down to minister to those people. And I decided, well, if he could do that for years, I could do something to help people too. And the thing of it was, this man that lived over north of Burlington, he had a second barrel. He went to a reporter of the Burlington Hawkeye and told his story. And he got a hold of a man that listened to him. And I wasn't taking the Burlington Hawkeye papers, so I didn't know about it, but it came out on I think maybe it's Saturday instead of Sunday, that the Sunday edition comes out on Saturday in the Burlington Hawkeye. About 3/4 or so of the front page of this edition was about this neglect of the Quaker cemetery there in Lee County. And he had called me, although he hadn't come and talked to me, and it was in the part of the write-up. But the thing that interested me was the fact that a lady that I knew that lived east of Salem called me that Sunday afternoon after we got home from church. She said, "I saw the article in the Burlington Hawkeye, and I'm sending you a check for $500 to help build the fence." She had a lot of relatives buried there, and she wanted a fence. Well, I said, "Well, that's a pretty big encouragement to build the fence." And with a few more people responding to the Sour Grapes article, it worked. It worked. I got the money to pay for the material and a custom fence builder to build the fence. And it is fenced. The livestock aren't running over it. I started to set up all the stones, but that was a bigger task than I could do as a man 80 years old. And I hope somebody else will take an interest and help with that project. Well, that's a part of the story. It's not all the story. Doug and I here in March, I guess it was, decided we were going up to Pleasant Plain Meeting one Sunday to worship with the group there and see if they knew some good stories about the Underground Railroad. And then after meeting there, we visited some places that were in a part of the story. A man by the name of Alan Stalker lived here in Fairfield in that early day and was a kind of a leader in helping runaways get north to Pleasant Plain or to Richland or to a community in between called Clay. This was a congregational community between Pleasant Plain and Richland. Well, as we visited Clay community that day, I remembered something. I served as pastor of Le Grand Friends Meeting, which is 10 miles east of Marshalltown, for several years, a while back. And I remembered that Lyle and Ursula Mills Johnson told me about Ursula's grandfather helping in the Underground Railroad at Clay. So I hunted up the book that her sister wrote about the Mills family. And after reading about Manning Mills helping with the Underground Railroad, I said to myself, well, there must be something more to this story too. And so I called Lyle and Ursula's son Norman and talked to him by telephone. And he began to tell me some things that about knocked me off my chair. One was that his third great-grandfather's niece, Ruth Mills, was the second wife of John Brown. Now, that's digging up things from the Underground Railroad. And another brother of Manning Mills, who would be Norman's great-grandfather's brother, who lived out in Cass County in southwestern Iowa, was active in the Underground Railroad. So the stories aren't all in. We only know part of it. And this is an appropriate time because, as I understand it, these interstate roads that are being built over somewhere between Donaldson and Mount Pleasant, there's going to be a visitor center, and it's going to emphasize the Underground Railroad. And there'll be literature there about the Underground Railroad and about taking side trips across southern part of Iowa. And so I'm interested in helping them know about what went on. And that's why I'm interested in coming and talking to you and sharing with you this evening. I think maybe this is a good time, Doug, to kind of take a break. And I call to your attention the literature that's laid out that you may want to investigate. We'll take a several-minute break here, and then for those of you who want to remain and have a time of questions and sharing again, why, we'll do that. So, Doug, if you'd take over a little bit, I will meet in a few minutes.
But this combination of good flat prairie ground to farm, but also timber ground nearby, whatever. But their migration tended to go up. So here's Pleasant Plain up here. But these initial settlements that happened down here, Old Pilot Grove was a Quaker meeting, New Garden Quaker meeting, East Grove, Glendale, Salem. And what it was is families, they would settle in an area, and then they could set up a meeting, a Quaker meeting. And these would be pioneer hamlets. And it turned out that this place, all through here, very quickly became pretty densely settled with small subsistence farms. And lots of people living out here. And in these hamlets, then, they tended to be, because, the Society of Friends, these people all had previously come from Indiana, Ohio, Virginia, Carolinas, and that. They had family ties and sort of knew each other. And the organization of the old Society of Friends, it was very social. So there would be meetings, conventions, and that, and people would get to these. They were very social functions as well as religious, and so ties of kinship and ties of religion, and then just social ties. There's a lot of connections that people had. So in coming forward, a lot of these families knew each other. So this trajectory kept going. There was West Branch up here, that area, Lynn County, Quaker meetings up there, and then start going over here, Oskaloosa, and then Des Moines. But as you start seeing how this goes across, everything is sort of another buggy drive away. The interval of connection between pioneer families was pedestrian. So it was either the day foot travel or buggy buggy drive away. So what I'm getting back to was my interest in this, because I was thrust into being a conductor of the Underground Railroad with my group of fugitives. So I was always intent on how do they do it. I'm born and raised in Iowa City, and growing up in Iowa City, there were always a few homes that were pointed to as saying they were stations on the Underground Railroad. And then relating back to this map here, so there's Iowa City, but then how did they get from Mount Pleasant, or how did they get from Ottumwa to Iowa City? And horse and buggy era. And then I know from moving these 15 fugitives that you had to have lots of help, because you can only move them a day at a time. And in a day, you got to feed them, you've got to water them, you've got to shelter them, you have to rest them on a cycle. And so what this shows is this ready-made network of civilly disobedient people who you can start to see that, and I just know there were a lot of people that actually were involved in it. But at the same time you say that, it's an interesting time. And, you know, kind of like Lewis has, you know, has revealed to me a number of stories of what I marvel at is this thing of, you know, like one group of slaves that showed up in Salem. So the Missouri slave owners came after them, show up in town, and they go around town and they harass the Quakers there, and they're going, where are the slaves? And they actually basically hold the town hostage. They seal off the town, they go through the town, and it's high drama on the frontier. And they put different Quakers, and there were, you know, names were kind of known. The notorious ones were, it was known who they were. And so they were put under house arrest. These are prominent citizens. And then you have somebody else living right there going, look at guys, I'll help you find your slaves. So here you have someone living in Salem who turns against his neighbors and then takes them outside of town into some woods and helps gather up some of the slaves that are in the area. And same thing here, you know, so you have one of the Quaker meetings, which is right out here, just, you know, not too far away from the river. You have the Unitarians down here that are abolitionists. You have the Quakers right here. But then you have Slaughterer, who is perfectly willing to be hired as a slave hunter, living right here. And same thing up here in New Garden. There are a couple of stories of like the Bond brothers who get turned in by their neighbors, or that story that Lewis told, where, you know, one neighbor turns in another neighbor, and this sheet of paper that I handed out here that you have there, the part there about the 1850 law, at the bottom of it, if you read, you know, they're fines. There's a criminal penalty and there's a civil penalty. So, and what I did is I took the Fugitive Slave Law and stripped out all of the legal, you know, the congressional law is very long and pretty dense. But so I just took out all the legal and then put the operative words in bold print. And you can see, so it's like, it was to give any kind of help, and even if you knew if help was being given, you were liable. And, you know, harboring, you know, aiding, abetting, all of the, you know, you look at the language of that. When this law came out, it put everybody at risk. So if a fugitive passed through your neighborhood and you just happened to know about it, you were liable to this law, including at the bottom, criminal and civil penalty. So, you know, Lewis pointed out that one story of someone being arrested, or, you know, because he was harboring a slave, neighbor turns him in, and it costs that person hundreds of dollars in 1800 money. So it's an interesting deal. The moral courage. This is the part of the story that I really like. I love, you know, human stories that show this, you know, moral conviction and the courage that some people take when they do something that's, you know, out of the ordinary, extraordinary. And this ends up becoming a story where these are Iowans. These are us. And this is an Iowa story. These are people that live all along here. You know, we're telling the particular story of this, the Quakers, as they're there. But, you know, it's on South Main Street right out here. It's on Cedar Creek right out here. It's down in Birmingham. And it's north of town. It's all these people who, for their moments in this, and you know, it was a conspiracy, it was a brotherhood, it was, and you know, this was, you know, moral courage really being shown on the part of individuals. So I find it just it's a terrific story, and it's right under us. It's the Underground Railroad. It's pretty neat.
I have the Daggs descendants lived at Cantrell where I grew up, just south of town. As a small child, I can remember them. There are none left now, but they talked about their ancestors were slaveholders in Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know just how their ancestors connected, but they lived just a few miles south of Cantrell.
Well, Doug, when you're talking about the routes, you're familiar with Turkey Run. There at the Jefferson County Wildlife Area, you drive your horses across that ford.
Yeah.
It used to be called Nigger Run, which runs about straight north and south from east side of Birmingham, which would be an easy way to follow coming from Keosauqua. Follow that till it hits Cedar Creek. Take a left, it hits Crow Creek, and then takes them just about we take up to Chautauqua Park area. But I mean, there's still a tree covered draw that goes right up South Main. So even today, this between Birmingham and Fairfield is practically all forest and streams that they can follow quite easily and be hidden.
What was the little town in Missouri that you said had the viewing center or?
Oh yeah, it's a state historic site. It's Athens, Missouri. Athens, yeah. If you go down to Farmington, go south.
Go south on that.
Yeah, right before you get to Farmington on high as you're coming to.
It has a house with a cannonball hole through it.
Yeah, it's quite a site actually.
They have reenactments every so often too.
Yeah. They in the middle of, on the anniversary dates of there was an actual formed Civil War battle there, and that makes it quite a unique historic site. And so they have an anniversaries of that. I think it's in early August every year.
Being interested in the Underground Railroad has brought to me many new friends, including Doug Hamilton and others. John Zeller has been doing research for the State Historical Society on the Underground Railroad for, a couple years, I believe. And the State Historical Society is cooperating with the Department of Transportation on this new visitor center that I spoke about earlier. Then there's another interesting side to this recent interest in the Underground Railroad. There's a man by the name of James Hill who's located out at Omaha, Nebraska, who's with the National Park Service, and their interest in establishing some centers that will emphasize the Underground Railroad. And I wanted to tell you something else about John Zeller. He's not only helping to maybe do the most thorough research work on the Underground Railroad that I expect has been done in Iowa up to this point. He is planning to write a book about the Underground Railroad, and I'm very much interested in this because I think up to this point, Owen Garrettson's article about traveling on the Underground Railroad that appeared in the Iowa Journal of History and Politics is probably the most complete write-up about the Underground Railroad that has been written so far. But I think John Zeller's upcoming book will be a book even more complete, and it will be something that I think Iowans will really be interested in, because it will not only show what happened in a certain area, it will show what happened all across the state, and bringing the whole complete picture together as I understand it. So some wonderful things are in the offing about our history and the Underground Railroad.
I should say that I in my discovery of Lewis, he has just a marvelous collection of research material. And so some of the things that he's unearthed, I have put on the internet. So bit by bit, we're working at getting something that Lewis did is at one point, it was kind of interesting that in the latter part of the 19th century, at that point, people started reminiscing about the settlement days of Iowa. So people later in their lives started putting together collections of their memories. And out of some of those collections were then starting to come some of these first-hand accounts of how the Underground Railroad was done. So Lewis, in his research, discovered some of those, and so I was really excited to find that material, and so we're working at actually getting that so it can be read on the internet. These are magazines that were actually created to be sold to the pioneer generation as they were older. So it'd be like, you know, if you go to the grocery store now, you can buy your magazine of whatever your interest is. Well, this is the same kind of specialty type magazine for, you know, for a population of people. So on this yellow sheet of paper I handed out, way at the bottom of it, if you see on one side or the other, there's a URL there that's for Salem fugitive slaves. It's also, I tacked it onto something else I was working on too, so that's why you see the thing about the Horace / and then Salem fugitive slave. But if you type that in there, then this will get to an index of several things that Lewis has.
I'd like to see the hands of those that are a part, maybe members of the board of the museum here. Are there people here that are a part of the museum board? Ben Taylor was very much interested in the history, and I remember sharing with him when living here in Fairfield, and we had something in common. We used to attend auction sales and renew bits of interesting information. But a number of people, when you were getting ready to take a forward step, I don't know about the museum, Ben Taylor brought a group from Fairfield down to the Lewelling House, and my wife and I were there that day, and I thought Ben Taylor paid my wife and I quite a compliment. That group there wanted us to come when they saw what had been done there with the Lewelling House. He wanted to know if we couldn't come up and help with the museum up here in Fairfield. Well, that would have been very interesting, but we had so many ties of responsibilities that we couldn't accept it. But it was good, I guess, for our ego that he asked us about doing it.
Well, George Lee took our historical society to the Lewelling House just about what, 3 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
We recently visited there.
Yeah.
Well, this was an earlier time I remember that occasion well, and glad for you that you are progressing in that, and glad for the work that the Historical Society is doing in helping to keep alive things that are important in the lives of our people.
You know, Lewis,
Yes?
something I would add is, as we're talking about the Lewelling House,
Yes?
I do know just off the top of my head that they have hours, usually Sunday afternoons. It makes a nice time to go and visit the museum there. And I know for myself, the trip that I like to take is to combine, as long as I'm going that direction, oftentimes I'll go to Athens and check in with there at the Athens Museum, and then find my way to Salem. That makes for quite a long day, but it's a good trip.
Thank you, Doug. I want to, Mary Alice, won't you stand up? My cousin over here who brought me up this evening is a member of the board of the Lewelling House, and she would be glad to welcome any of you at any time to come and visit there. And so...
Oh, and they are very available by appointment also, so if there are groups
That's
that want to
right.
come down there, it's just a
They're
matter
open
of-
on Sunday afternoons from 1 to 4, May through September, but they will also open by appointment if you give them a ring. Yes.
I'd like to speak on behalf of our Van Buren County Historical Society. And of course, we have historic Pearson House down at Keosauqua, another stop on the Underground Railroad. We'd be very, very happy to have you come. And our official time for being open is on Sundays from Memorial Day through middle of October, but also likewise by appointment. And we're very happy to have you.
Thank you very much for that information. Another recent thing that I discovered, Ralph Arnold shared some things about the Underground Railroad that was new to me, at least, maybe. And this was about as the slave owners and catchers got to watching down around Farmington, that area, about runaways crossing there. The runaways would come across to the west and then cross the Des Moines River up in Iowa instead of down there where the Des Moines River is the boundary line between Missouri and Iowa. And Ralph Arnold has some articles about the Underground Railroad as the runaways came through Birmingham and then over to Salem. New things that I have been learning in more recent days. Anything else that you have that you would like to share? Or question that you'd like to raise?
I'd share something. I brought a couple of things. My great-great-grandfather was a minister in southern Indiana in Princeton, which is just 30 miles above the Ohio River. And he had a lot of troubles with the governor of Kentucky sending a requisition to the governor of Indiana to have him sent down there to answer to violating Fugitive Slave Law.
Come speak into the microphone. You get your moment to... No.
I'm sorry, this just seemed so appropriate here. I'm not... This is really an old newspaper, and I shouldn't be taking it out like this without taking care of it properly, but my great-great-grandfather was after he had to leave, he had a farm in Princeton, Indiana, and he had to leave because the governor of Kentucky sent a requisition to the governor of Indiana saying, send that guy down here to answer to violating the Fugitive Slave Laws, because he was helping. He was a Presbyterian minister. So somebody in Indianapolis, and this is the real thing too, actually, sent him a letter dated June 29th, 1855. Dear sir, it is certain that the governor of Indiana has this day ordered a requisition to be issued against you to send you to Kentucky to be tried on a charge of violating the slave laws of that state. A force to arrest you will undoubtedly soon be after you. A word to the wise is sufficient. In other words, get the heck out of there, you know, which he did. So he ended up, there's a town called Cynthiana near Princeton, and the people kind of hid him off for a while, and then he went to Canada for a bit. But he ended up in Oberlin, Ohio, which was a big center of abolitionist activity. John Brown's father was president of Oberlin College, and anyway, so he did a lot of speaking, you know, there. And so this was one of the things, Let the North Awake. T.B. McCormick will discuss the immorality, illegality, and unconstitutionality of American slavery and the duty and power of the general government to abolish it. And so these would get put up, and he talked a lot. And I shouldn't have this out either, but I just saw this in the paper, and I thought, oh, I gotta see what my stuff, you know. But anyway, this was a New York Tribune from November 9th, 1855, in which Horace Greeley wrote an editorial about this issue of T.B. McCormick and Kentucky and what's right and what should be done and all this business. So, but anyway, I just wanted to share that stuff. But
Thank you.
I just want to say one more thing, and I just always been so proud of him because he got kicked out of his church for speaking anti-slavery rhetoric from the pulpit, and also kicked out of his state because he had a farm in Indiana and he had to leave for 9 years and be in Ohio until the war was over and he could come back, and which he did do. So I think he did a good job of moral, you know, courage. You know? So, anyway.
I want to thank you for coming. I don't know, Doug, whether anyone else in the leadership has anything to say in closing, but I appreciate your interest in coming this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Savage, and thank you, Doug.